And recording. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this lead-based paint calculation worksheet tutorial. Like I said, it looks like we have most people on, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. Okay. For those of you that don't already know me, I'm Sarah Bramer, and I'm one of the 4 home program managers. I'll be leading a short overview and providing some general information for today's tutorial. I believe everybody was muted on attendance or on entrance, but if you notice you're unmuted, please mute yourself. Also, we are recording this tutorial so that it can be posted on our website for future reference. I'll now introduce the other program managers and their roles in this tutorial. Courtney Burke will be walking us through the form and how to fill it out. Tom Weinheimer will be reviewing the levels of lead hazard controls and showing examples of calculations that we've received. And Leland Barup is on, and he will be monitoring the chat. If you have a question, please send a chat message either to everyone or directly to Leland so he can see it, or you can feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in with a question. We'll be pausing as we go through the slides and transition from different presenter, so that's also an opportunity to ask a question. Next slide, please. I wanted to start off by reviewing why we are hosting this tutorial. Obviously, it's to ensure lead-based paint compliance, especially when other federal funds are being used, such as CDBG. As your program managers, we want to know if additional federal funds are being used from the time of project setup. Reason number 2, all homeowner occupied rehabilitation setups now require the lead paint calculation regardless of the setup amount. We informed groups via email back in February, and Courtney, can you put it in presentation?
Sorry, I was just having some technical difficulties going back now.
Hold on. Okay, so point number 2, as I stated, all rehab setups now require the calculation worksheet regardless of the setup amount. This applies to units that are claiming exemption as well. So if the unit meets one of the exemption criteria, you would just still fill out the top part of the form and provide the backup documentation for the appropriate exemption indicated. And finally, we wanted to host this tutorial to encourage groups not to cap their setups at $24,999. With the cost of materials and labor today, we know that $25,000 doesn't go very far when trying to do moderate rehabilitation. Unfortunately, this threshold is part of the statutory federal regulations from the 90s and would take an act of Congress to get that threshold raised, so that's unlikely to happen anytime soon. To sort of rectify this, we have in the last few years increased the amount of home funds per unit to $65,000 to help groups account for this. So, we want to encourage groups to consider doing fewer units with more funds per unit to fully address any lead paint issues that might be in the home. Also, it's a common misconception that setting a unit up for more than $25,000 will automatically trigger lead abatement. This is not always the case, as Courtney and Tom will illustrate as we get into the worksheet and the examples. Next slide, please. So here are some resources. Again, I think these were sent out to groups in the few emails we've sent out about this, but again, the first one is our calculation worksheet. Be sure to utilize the view description links for additional information for each line of the form that you have to fill out. If you haven't already checked out the toolkit on the HUD Exchange, I would highly recommend it. There are lots of resources in the toolkit, and they do a great job of explaining or simplifying the federal regulations. The last link is for the HUD-led training. Again, I would highly recommend checking these out as well. I think they do the training about annually, and if you're signed up on the HUD Exchange, you should get an email, but they also have videos of the past trainings on their website, so you can watch those as well. While we are hosting this tutorial to provide some general guidance and technical assistance, we as program managers are not lead paint experts. You should be consulting with your procured lead professional or risk assessors for assistance with addressing lead-based paint during your rehabilitation projects. Before I turn this over to Courtney, are there any questions at this point? Anything in the chat?
Nope.
Okay, great. Thanks, Leland. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney.
Thank you, Sarah. So my name is Courtney Burke. I'm one of the other program managers here for the home program. And I'm going to go through the first step of filling out the lead calculation worksheet. So as Sarah mentioned, even if the unit is exempt, you still need to fill out this form and select the NA option in the list of drop-downs where it says select an exemption. I'm going to briefly go through some of the exemptions we have on here. Not all of them may apply, but I'm just going to run through them briefly. So the first one is being built after January 1st, 1978. So this is when the sale and use of lead-containing paint was banned. Therefore, anything built after that date is exempt. Next, a zero dwelling unit, also known as an SRO or single room occupancy. This is exempt, however, typically doesn't apply for owner-occupied rehab. Next is elderly or disabled housing. So some groups might get confused with this exemption because many of you serve these two populations specifically. However, this exemption is for housing that is exclusively used for people with disabilities or elderly. An example of that would be a nursing home or potentially supportive housing for people with disabilities. So typically you're not going to be able to use that exemption for what we do in owner-occupied rehab. Next is previously determined free from lead-based paint and or already achieved lead-based paint. So this is going to be if the house previously was inspected or had a risk assessment done and it was determined there was no lead, or if there was lead found and it was remediated and then cleared. So I do also want to mention, if you do claim an exemption, you'd have to supply documentation to support it. So for example, these two would be the clearance report. The last is rehab that will not disturb painted surfaces. Again, we typically don't see this, but if you were doing a rehab project that wouldn't disturb any painted surfaces whatsoever, then you could use this exemption. An example would be if you determined that the only thing that needed to be rehabbed was the roof, and you wouldn't be disturbing the soffits or fascia. Therefore, you wouldn't be disturbing any painted surfaces, and could use this exemption. The next part of the form is just the general information, so your SHARS ID, LPA name, IDIS activity number. You most likely will not have at this point because you are submitting it with setup, so you can leave that blank and fill it in later, and then the current submission date. So the first step here is looking at the total amount of federal assistance invested in the project. So the lead-based paint regulations apply to all sources of federal funding, not just home. This is extremely important, or this is why it's extremely important to include all sources of federal funding on the worksheet. So number one, the number of assisted units is always going to be 1 unless you were previously approved to include rental units. Number 2, the amount of home funds is the same amount as the setup amount, which includes the hard cost, soft cost, and project delivery. Number 3, many times CDBG funds will be paired with home, so you can add that there. 4 and 5, frequently we'll see projects that include other sources of federal funding that are not home or CDBG. So you can add those on those lines. Some examples of other federal funding could be HOPWA, ESG, supportive housing, Section 8, or other HUD rental assistance programs. And you can view more examples by clicking the view description link on the right-hand side of the form. I'm just going to pause. Are there any questions on this section of the form in either the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question.
Looks like we got a quick question in the chat just now. And this maybe it's not as much of a question. To clarify, in most units, not all the paint is lead-based. Therefore, if we are rehabbing a surface that is not lead paint, the last point would still apply.
What do they mean, the last point?
If you could just clarify what point that is.
While we're waiting for that, I can clarify. It depends on the amount of assistance going into the unit. So as Tom is going to get into a little bit later, the different levels of remediation, there's the first level is paint testing, the second is risk assessment and interim controls, and the third is risk assessment and abatement. We're going to get into a little bit of those later, but depending on the level of the amount of funds going into the project will depend on what you have to test and inspect.
Looks like it was in regards to the previous slide, so if we could just jump back one, clarify it.
This one or the?
I'm guessing it would be.
Oh, I'm assuming they mean the last bullet.
We are rehabbing a surface that is not lead paint. The last point would still apply. So rehab will not disturb painted surfaces, I would guess is what they're referring to.
So they're rehabbing something that is not painted or was previously deemed no lead. That would make a difference.
I think they're trying to talk but can't seem to unmute themselves. But what I'm thinking the question is if they are rehabbing a surface that is not lead paint, they're still disturbing painted surfaces. So they're asking like if we are going to disturb a painted surface, but that painted surface is not does not have lead in it. That
if they're going to disturb painted surfaces, you have to determine from a professional whether or not it has lead in it. And again, that will depend on how much funds are being invested. And also I think us as the panelists and co-hosts, you should be able to unmute attendees. Tom, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, we're probably going to see this a little later on if we wanted to continue.
Yeah.
And then if she still has questions, we can hit it afterwards.
Sounds good. All right, so shall I continue, or do we have any other questions regarding step 1? All
I think
right.
we're clear on the chat side.
Okay, great. So that brings us to step 2, computing the total rehab cost. So step 2 determines the amount of rehab costs that are being invested in the project. So the lead safe housing rule allows you to subtract the cost of lead-based paint hazard reduction from the overall rehab cost to determine the level of remediation to follow. So item 1, the estimated rehab cost is the cost to correct the substandard conditions and meet home property standards as well as code. Another way to think of it is it's just the hard costs. So you're not including soft cost or project delivery. And line 1 should include all funding in a project regardless of source. So this means if there was federal funds as well as non-federal funds going into the project, that would all be reflected in line 1. Number 2, the cost of lead-based paint hazard reduction work includes all costs to reduce or eliminate lead-based paint hazards in order to comply with the lead-based paint regulations. This is where the risk assessment and the work scope come in handy, as they can help you determine eligible costs that you can deduct. Some examples of eligible costs include the risk assessment, worksite preparation, occupant relocation, storage, or protection of belongings, interim controls or abatement activities to reduce or eliminate lead hazards, as well as clearance activities that include the visual inspections, assessments, dust wipes, and reports. So you can see here on the screen, the total estimated rehab costs are $28,000. It was determined that $7,500 was eligible to be deducted, leaving the total rehab costs for $20,000. And again, I'm going to pause here. Are there any questions on computing the total rehab costs?
Open in the chat.
I can't see the participants while I'm sharing the screen. Does it look like anybody is trying to chat? Okay. So step 3 is to determine the lesser of the two calculations. So this helps us determine which level of remediation is required. And I have 2 examples on the screen for you. The lead safe housing rule allows you to use the lesser amount of either the federal assistance going into the project or the rehab costs going into the project. So in the top example, it shows that after the calculations, the lesser amount is the rehab cost. However, on the second example, it shows you the lesser amount is federal assistance. Usually, rehab costs will only be more than federal assistance if non-federal funds are also invested in the project. And as I mentioned on the last slide, when entering the amount of rehab costs, you do have to include both federal and non-federal sources. All right, are there any questions on this slide or any of the previous slides that I went through.
Yeah, I do have a question in the chat here. So someone was wondering if they're painting a floor and that found lead, that they would then include that in the hazard reduction cost.
Yes. So if you're painting the floor and eliminating temporarily or permanently, trying to eliminate the lead hazard, that would be an eligible deduction. And some other examples might include if you have to paint the windowsills or replace the windows. Painting is a big one that we see. Trying to think of some other examples, but yeah, if what you're doing is to eliminate or remove the lead hazard, that is an eligible cost to deduct.
Yeah, I just was going to share, I think we most commonly see painting and windows as like a big cost that groups can, reduce their calculation by. But I also didn't know if there was anyone else like in the panel that or in the attendee group, that has experience and, has done this before and examples of what you've reduced your calculation by as for one of your projects. Okay, I guess we'll just keep going then.
All righty. Okay, so next I'm going to turn over to Tom. And again, he's going to go through the different levels of remediation as well as some examples of some forms that we have received.
Thanks, Courtney. So as Courtney kind of alluded to, depending on the lesser amount that you got from section 3 depends on what part you have to fill out for step 4. So we're going to quickly just kind of go over step 4 and what section you have to fill out. So if the cost is lower than $5,000, you would fill out part 1, and you would then be required to test only test surfaces that are going to be disturbed. You would follow lead safe practices on the disturbed surface, which is interim controls. As alluded to earlier, interim controls is like painting over surfaces. And then once that work is complete, you would get a clearance report for the work that you did, that the work you did meets the requirements. So to that example earlier, or the question earlier, if you're under 5,000 and you're not disturbing any surfaces, any lead paint surfaces, you wouldn't test them, so you wouldn't you wouldn't be required to test them, so you wouldn't have to do interim controls because you would only have to test the surfaces that you're disturbing. So the question earlier, it does depend on your how much funds are going to the project, as we'll see from the other examples. We can get to the next slide, please. So if the lesser the amount cost is between 25,000 and 5,000, you would then fill out part 2, and that would require you to do a risk assessment of the entire unit, not just the surfaces that you're disturbing, but you would do a risk assessment of the entire unit. You would perform interim controls on all lead hazards that test positive in your risk assessment. And then once again, you would get a clearance report once the work is finished. So in this example, for that same question, you would have to do interim controls on a non-disturbed surface. So depending on how much federal funds are going into the project will determine on what your requirements are. So for that one question, you can just see the difference of your requirements if you're doing above 5,000 federal funds compared to under 5,000. And then next Next slide, please, Court. And then if you're doing above 25,000 of the lesser amount in the section 3, you would fill out part 3 of the section 4 for step 4, and that is for you would do, once again, you would do a risk assessment of all area of the entire unit and common area, but with rehab, with your program of owner-occupied rehab, we're only doing the unit. You would have to abate any positive hazards, and you would get an EPA certified abatement contractor to do that. And then you would again get a clearance report for the unit. Just to hit on some of points, example of abatement is a closure, encapsulation, replacement of components and fixtures. So like if you're replacing a window that has lead paint on it, that would count as abatement as you are replacing the lead, and that's a permanent, abatement is more of a permanent fixture for lead hazards. Abatement's not always a full strip down, so like it's not, I think, you know, people kind of get a little hazard of abatement could be too onerous. As Sarah alluded to earlier in the presentation that, you know, we did increase the amount a couple years ago to $65,000 to allow more funds for abatement. This is a federal requirement of $25,000. You can talk to your congressperson about raising the limit. Best of luck. But until then, you know, this is our, you know, we're trying to help you guys out on at least providing more federal funds or more funds for these projects for you so that you would be able to get more work done. We prefer not to lessen the amount of work being done on projects so that we're trying to get under an amount. And if you're having problems finding an abatement contractor, your program manager should be will be able to kind of help steer you in the right direction. So always reach out if you have any questions or concerns on that. I know I tend to talk fast. So I might have done that quickly. Leland, is there any questions in the chat or anything?
Not a question for now, but we did get somebody weighing in, suggesting that just to attempt to try to bundle the LP or lead-based paint reduction items together and get a bid on those if possible, separate from the overall scope, or at least kind of called out. And it makes it easier for, you know, filling out that worksheet and getting a sense on if you're close to falling below or above the $25,000 threshold.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I've definitely seen that on work scopes and contractor bids before.
All right, that's all we have. Court, you want to get us to the next slide?
We actually got a quick question before moving on that just came in. You know, to clarify that if the cost goes over $5,000, that the group's required to do a risk assessment of all the rooms and not just the rooms they're working in.
Yes, home has like a whole house. So once we're putting a federal enough federal funds, we should be doing the whole house approach and testing the units, doing a risk assessment for the entire unit.
Correct. I mean, for the home program, you know, I don't think any of us have ever seen a setup for $5,000 or less. So that first stage doesn't really apply to, you know, the work you guys are doing for this home program, right? You're mostly going to be doing the second or third tier lead hazard, you know, controls at that point. So yeah, and once you get into those two tiers, as we've stated, you have to do a risk assessment for the entire unit.
And also, just to touch on that, your certified lead assessor should know this. But yeah, if it's over 5,000, it automatically gets a risk assessment, which is of the entire unit, versus under 5,000, it's only the painted surfaces you'll disturb. Any other questions?
All right.
No,
Well,
we're all set for now.
Cool. All right. So we're just going to go over some examples here. So here's an example of one of the lead-based calculation form with home funds only. We can see that in this example, we have $42,000 of federal funds. But when we get to step 2, and we deduct the lead calculation, the lead hazard work out, that's 16,000. Also 36,000 of that is in hard costs, so deduct 16,000, and that would only put us at 20. So here's an example of you're seeing a high setup amount, but because you're able to deduct your lead hazard work out, you're able to only you're only triggering lead hazard reduction. So this is like one of the example of don't be afraid to set up a unit more than 25,000 because it's not automatically triggering abatement. And you see they fill out section 2 of the of step 4, and then also what's not on here is that at the end you do certify these signing and dating. That was skipped on the slide, but that is step 5. This is sign and date. So that's here's one example of, you're seeing a high setup amount of 42,000, but we're only triggering interim controls. Next slide, please. So here's one where you're seeing where this one's triggering abatement. They put their total home funds as 57,000 and 5.8 thousand. So that's 62.8 thousand of federal funds. Total hard cost 56,000. They reduced 7,000. That puts at 49,000. Because it's all federal funds, step 2 and 3 kind of match, and the lesser 2 is 49,000, and they would then have to fill out in step 4 the third section, which is lead abatement. So that's an example of one of the federal calculation forms for abatement. Next slide. Here's an example of, again, home and CDBG funds that are 47,000 for home, 9,000 for CDBG. That's 56,000 federal funds. But because they were able to reduce, have 26,000 of lead hazard reduction work, they're only triggering interim controls because the lesser of 2 amounts is 13,000. So again, you see a high setup amount, but that doesn't always mean that your total rehab cost is going to be above the 25,000. So I think this is a good example of finding a decent amount of lead hazard reduction work. And then next slide. And then here's an example of where it's multiple funding sources that is triggering abatement. As you see, someone sets a unit for $24,999. So even for home funds, you're under 25,000, but they have another $5,600 of other federal funds. So for federal funds, they're above the 25,000, and then for step 2, you see they have the 48,000 in rehab, 16,000 in lead reduction leads to 32,000 in total rehab costs. So here's an example of where step 3 is your lesser 2 cost because there's a high amount of non-federal funds in this project. But both of them, even though we're only at $24,999 in home funds, because the other federal funds puts us over the 25,000, this would trigger abatement. So these are just some examples of different circumstances that you can see where the but in this example is kind of what we're hammering on. Don't be afraid of, because just because you're at $24,999 doesn't mean you wouldn't also trigger abatement with other funding sources. Is there any questions in the chat, Leland?
Nope, we're clear.
If there's no questions, and I can turn it back over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Tom. So that kind of wraps up our presentation part of this little tutorial. Hopefully it was somewhat informative and helpful. Again, we are not lead-based paint experts, and you should be consulting your lead professionals that you're working with, because each project, each home is going to be different. Like Tom said, we want to encourage you guys to really address the whole house and, all of its issues. Don't be afraid of going up to the full max of $65,000 if that's what it takes, right? We want to make these houses safe and healthy for the inhabitants. So again, just don't shy away from that. We can open it up to some questions or comments. We're also looking for, you guys as the practitioners to kind of share some experience if you've had any kind of good or bad dealing with lead paint in your area. We are looking for firsthand experience or testimonials too. So if you don't feel like sharing with the group, if you can reach out to your program manager so we can better assist other LPAs that are going through abatement. By now, hopefully you've all realized that we have a link at the bottom of our email signatures where you can find a lead certified contractor or risk assessor by like your zip code or your geographic area, because we have had groups say that they had trouble finding them, and we can sort of help you reach out to some certified contractors if that's a hang up for you in your area. So I guess, first of all, are there any other questions or comments in the chat, Leland?
No, it looks like we're all caught up on that.
Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? I don't know if the attendees can, if you guys can unmute yourself and just ask.
I don't know.
They raised their hands also, we can go and unmute them if anyone.
We can't. Oh, let me see if I can unmute everybody.
Oh yeah, they said they can't unmute themselves. Bear with us.
I'm trying to unmute people. Feel free to mute yourself again. Let's see.
Okay, yep, so you've all been unmuted. So if anybody has a question or wants to share some words of wisdom with the other LPAs on the call.
Still muted. But let me find Mary here.
Yeah.
Right when I typed that, it clicked in.
Yay!
This is Mary Lawrence with Rebuilding Together Saratoga County. I mean, I think some of it is just needing to go through some of these projects, right? I think some of it is just this like probably unlogical fear, like we're just like afraid of these projects. So I think some of it is just getting more used to going through them so that we just have more experience. But also I think the part that we're trying to figure out is some of the different language, and I know that's not necessarily what this is about, but we're doing our own research and talking to our own sort of experts on our team about the like positive and intact versus positive and deteriorated. And so, you know, it's more than just, so what you guys went over here is great with the worksheet. I think there's other pieces of it that are just more complicated. And but the toolkit here that you put on here actually has some really great like almost decision trees. So I did not know about those toolkits, so I'm gonna explore some of that to help us make the decisions, like, you know, when we have to do certain kinds of controls depending on what we find in the report. So I think it's just experience. We need to like go through this on a couple of projects and go through that we feel more comfortable with it.
Yeah, there's definitely more nuances than, you know, we covered in this tutorial. So again, you know, working with, I think, your lead professionals, and I'm glad you mentioned the toolkit. I really personally like the little flow chart, like decision trees that are on there. I mean, we go back as program managers and reference those a lot of times when you guys come to us with questions. So thanks for sharing that. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us. And, you know, if you do have specific questions you run across, just feel free to reach out to your program manager. We know that, like, as Mary stated, you know, there is kind of a, I don't want to say fear, but, you know, a lot of people are really timid about dealing with this. And so we want to, you know, help you in any way that we can to kind of get over the hump and really address the lead issues when required. All right, well, thanks everyone. We'll probably be posting this on the website in the near future. But as always, just reach out to your program manager if you have any questions.
20 minutes.
All right, thank you.